Steve was a good teacher.
I think he did a good job. I think he taught kids a lot of things other than math.
I'm trying to be nice because Steve was not the best math teacher in the world, and he would be the first to admit that.
Steve liked to do the science thing, especially with the geology part of it, because he was always into being out.
Great guy to work with. He didn't always do what you wanted him to do, but but he was an excellent teacher, and he really cared about that students were learning something, not just about math, about life and being prepared for school after high school. And
just how to be an adult. You know, let's make this decision and not that may not have to do with science or math.
That was his main focus in class. It wasn't the teaching of the math, but it was the teaching of the students.
He would just look at the kids and say, if you don't understand this, I'm always here. School doesn't start until 7:30. I get here at 7. Come in. If you couldn't do the homework last night, come in. If you didn't understand the concept today, come in at lunch. I'll spend my lunch with you. The first year I worked with him, we had a young woman. She was far behind in her math. And every lunch, Steve never actually ate lunch, as one would think. He survived on Cheetos,
corn nuts, and Diet Pepsi and Diet Mountain Dew.
It's almost all I ever saw him eat. And so he would be sitting there with this young woman, and he worked almost every day with her for a month or two until he caught her up. And I have no idea how many hours he spent off the clock working with those kids, because it was unacceptable to him that any of them were going to fail on his watch. He just kept trying. We had a young woman one year who couldn't even add and subtract or do decimals, and she hated him because she couldn't do what he was asking her to do, but he didn't hate her back. He just kept trying.
I don't remember seeing him upset at just about anybody. Very mellow, very easygoing, very forgiving. I can't imagine holding a grudge.
And finally at the end, she came to me and she said, I love Mr. Gladbach. And I said, well, I was waiting for that to happen. And I said, how did that happen? And she said, I hated him because I thought I could never do math, and I always felt bad in his class, but when he explains it to me one-on-one, I can do math. And that's who he was at school. That's who he was as a teacher.
It was easy to get him off topic too in class.
And the kids also knew that if they had had enough of pre-calculus and they couldn't absorb any more, they'd go, did you go hiking this weekend?
If you just brought up there, Mr. Gladbach, what did you do this weekend? He could probably go on for hours and hours.
They could mention 2 topics. 1, his girls, or 2, his mountain climbing, and he couldn't handle it. He'd go off topic for at least 10 minutes, and they would get a few minutes of respite from whatever sine or cosine or something he was trying to teach them.
In our Health Academy program, our students take classes that they need to pay for. For example, there are some courses called senior to sophomore courses, and they're offered through Colorado State University Pueblo. But students can also take these courses for college credit at the same time they're taking them for District 60 credit. So we're always struggling with getting kids to enroll because a lot of families didn't have the money. So one of Steve's big projects that he started off, and it was all his idea, was to start up a Health Academy Scholarship Foundation. And so we did. Up until this year, it's been called the Health Academy Foundation Scholarship. But since Steve passed, we thought it'd be a great idea if we named the scholarship the Steve Gladbach Memorial Foundation Scholarship. All students were in favor of that. It was a fantastic idea. Steve was a mentor to a lot of people in the Fort Seniors community, and I know he had a real special place for Eric Sangueza. And one of the pieces of advice that Steve gave Eric at one time were these 3 rules. Work hard, take care of yourself, and be nice. Now, those 3 rules are posted in some of the classrooms, and also every year the Health Academy students design a new t-shirt. Those 3 rules are on the t-shirt this year. That's the impact and legacy that Steve has on our Health Academy program.
My friend, Steve, what a man. and what a climber. He was like my brother. I've known Steve Glaback 22 years and over 200 mountains.
The first mountain I climbed with him was Silver Heels. And that was, we climbed it, I think on December 21st, it was maybe 2007 or so. And it was my first real mountain experience. I didn't have the clothes, I was fat and out of shape, and Steve loaned me everything, the snowshoes and the poles and gaiters, and I had a miserable time. I had never been on snowshoes and I was wallowing, and I gave up at about maybe 700 feet from the summit, but Steve talked me into getting up there, and that was my first experience, and then I swore that I would never do it again.
We spent a lot of time together every summer in the Weminuche and climbing 13ers in that area, so we would spend, a week, 10 days at a time.
My first 14ers experience with him was Mount Lindsay. We went up that gully and went really slow and had a great time.
One time we were all camped by the Trinities, by the lake, Trinity Lake actually, and we were climbing a lot of mountains, and we got into the 6th mountain, and then darned if the shortest way to camp was back over the 7th mountain. But it was really good because it really stretched me, that's for sure.
One of the first peaks I climbed with 14ers with Steve too was Mount Huron, and we make it to the top, and I go over there to find the summit register, and I'm signing my name, and I said, Steve, you want to come over here and sign the summit register? And he said, nah. And the person who was standing next to me, I didn't even know her, she says, I heard you say Steve. And she said, is that Steve Glaback? And I said, but he was the most humble guy. He would treat anybody who needed help with anything, even the person who'd never climbed before. He treated them the same as the person who'd climbed that peak 1,000 times. You could certainly tell that he was a teacher in all of his mountaineering too.
He was a mentor to me for sure. I mean, just all the way through on everything that I did as far as mountaineering is concerned.
He's always willing to set aside what he wanted to do to make sure that person he was with accomplished what they wanted to accomplish.
He went with me twice on Capitol. No, 3 times we went to Capitol. So he taught a lot to me about helping other people.
When I was training for Everest, Steve helped a lot, and we would go up Pikes Peak every way possible in the winter. We did some work on the Lincoln Icefall, as far as with the pack and Jumaring up. He was really an integral part of training. In fact, one kind of funny thing, he was always just really sad that he couldn't come with me on Everest, and he said, oh God, if I could have a sex change. And teasing. I always thought that was so good because it was a women's expedition.
He took a lot of kids too from his school on hikes and 14er hikes.
Probably his background as a teacher, I think, really helped as far as climbing with people, because he tended to let people, that would encourage you to be more confident in your own decisions if you were participating in decisions. He wasn't the type of climber which there are a lot of climbers that do this. It's like, well, it's my way or the highway. He respected my opinion, and we'd always discuss things and figure out what we were doing, and I really appreciated that.
He liked to talk, and we spent a lot of time together, and it was kind of a joke with us too that whenever we went on some trip with somebody that had never climbed with Steve before, I'd put them in the front seat with him, and I'd sit in the back seat because I'd heard all the stories 100 times. Or I'd make sure I was in the other car that was following, so not that I didn't enjoy Steve's stories, but I had heard them all.
He would come in on Monday mornings, and the first thing all of us knew to say was, where'd you go this weekend, Steve? Did you do some climbing? And then you had to prepare yourself for I went up, blah, 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 blah. And I asked him once, and I said, why in the world do you do this? And he said, it's where I find God. He said, I've never found God in a church, not since I was a little boy. But at the top of the mountains, when I get up there and I look out at everything, that's where I find God. Because I know none of this happened by accident.
He was very much an encouraging person.
Steve would always have a way of helping someone or saying, all right, let's try this a different way, or let's do this.
When we first started climbing, I wasn't too sure I was strong enough to keep up with Steve. He was totally encouraging and never put me down for being slow, a female.
Steve's ability to get people to do more than they thought was always something that I saw.
He came up with the idea of doing Cho-Yu, which is a Himalayan peak, the 6th highest mountain in the world. And I had no clue that I could do it. We'd keep climbing in the winter, and I'd climb with Steve, and he was very encouraging toward it. So I took that step and said, yeah.
Especially myself, many different occasions where I would say, okay, that's enough for me today. And he'd say, oh, we gotta go get these 2 more peaks over here. And thought, I don't know if I can do this, and then would.
He gave me the insight to really dream that I could go higher and dream larger than I'd ever done before. And I really thank him for that.
Steve had a way of motivating people to try to do things in their life that maybe they didn't think they could do, that didn't necessarily have to do with mountain climbing.
It's very hard to describe what Steve meant to me because he was an optimist and he had a lot of compassion. He touched my heart in many ways and helped spur me to do things I probably would not have done, because Steve was the kind of guy that always finding the light in things. And so I always knew I could talk to him pretty much about anything. And yeah, he'd make a couple of jokes at first, you know, but then he always had something to offer.
I mean, I think he was more doing it towards, well, let me show you you can do this that's going to help you overcome something else in your life.
We had a young man who was partially finished with college, who was involved in a very serious relationship with a young woman he was very much in love with, and they were waiting till he graduated to get married, and she discovered she was pregnant. And he came back to the Health Academy, and he sat and he cried to Steve, and he said, what is going to happen to my life? What am I going to do? And he said, he looked me right in the eyes, Mrs. Marino, and he said, it's going to be what you make it. It may not be exactly as you had it planned, but you're intelligent and you love her. Just don't give up. This is just a side trip. It's not the end of anything. It's the beginning of something wonderful. You're going to have a beautiful child. And that child will bless your life. And when he found out Steve died, he said, that conversation, it's like it flipped a switch in my brain. And he said, I went from someone who is in some degree of despair into someone feeling as though I had something to look forward to. And so that's who he was to his kids.
I first met Steve and Nona at a parenting support group. So Steve and Nona were at this support group because they were waiting to have a child in their lives. They had no children at that time. We laugh about, having our hopeful hearts on our sleeves at that time, and being very excited about a child in our lives, because we had all, most of us had suffered through some infertility issues and so forth. And Steve had eventually talked to me about community connections for families. And we both got involved on a committee that was about promoting safe and stable families here in Colorado. So we eventually kept that group going and then built more parenting and more support groups around adoption and around a lot of different special needs. So then in the meanwhile, I got the funding to develop a project called the SAFE Project, which stood for Successful Adoptive Families Empowerment. And Steve was on our board at that time.
When Steve and Nona first adopted Linda and then later had Elise, I noticed a big difference in Steve where he became more conservative and really talked about taking care of his girls, meaning Nona, Linda, and Elise. He balanced his life very well with his climbing and then also with taking care of the girls and with what they needed. And I thought that was quite interesting and quite loving of him.
My first conversation with Steve, and it was my first day there, and the first thing I learned about was his girls. And he talked about Elise and how fantastic she was and how bright. She was just a little one at that time, and how proud he was of her. And then he talked about Linda. And he shared with me that Linda had some special challenges to overcome because she was autistic. And I stopped in my tracks and I told him that I too had two girls. And one of them was straight forward ahead, highly intelligent, no problems, highly successful. But the other one, while also intelligent and straightforward, suffered from bipolar disorder. So we figured out immediately that we were members of a club that we really didn't ask to belong to. And how do you balance that? How do you balance your taking care of the one who doesn't seem to need you as much, but whom you equally love, and trying to provide something for the child that was going to need a tremendous amount of help? How do you deal with that? How do you push them to be the best that they can be?
We continued with our parenting journeys, and it turns out that Steve, I have 3 brothers, but Steve was the kind of guy that he became a brother to me. And we shared being home alone with kids. When the kids were little, we would trade off babysitting with each other's children, but I don't think a lot of people truly understood the compassion he has for children. He would always see the strengths, and even when we were doing our groups, you know, he would see the strengths in those kids from, you know, as old enough to walk, to be at playgroup. Steve didn't just come and help with his children, he came and helped with all the children. You know, he helped with my daughter a lot. My daughter was the type of girl that we really had to help bring her out of her shell, and Steve did a lot of that. Steve was the kind of father, I think, that was very nurturing and caring. He was big on touch, but also the kind of father that anytime he could persuade the girls to do something on their own, that he would be the first one to say, "You can do this." He did that with everybody. So of course he did it with his children.
And one of the joys that we shared was last year when Linda was doing so well. It was like a 180-degree turn, and I walked in one day and he was just celebrating, and he said, "Do you know that she scored higher on the math, on the Accuplacer than half of our kids out here?" And he was just ecstatic, you know, he just celebrated everything for both girls.
But also, even when he wasn't with the girls, he was talking about the girls, and his heart was with his girls.
He actually stayed home.
He was a stay-at-home dad for a long time.
Close to 5 years off of teaching.
I never heard Steve disgruntled about giving up what he wanted to do for somebody else.
I think Steve sacrificed quite a bit. I think as a father, that is a sacrifice to, especially to girls, of pretty much being their go-to person instead of going to work.
It was what they needed was more important.
I think that he was probably involved in the girls more so than a majority of dads. It was interesting to see how quickly Steve brought the girls into the hiking world.
I did a lot of hikes with my 2 kids and Steve and his 2 kids.
I can remember him having them on the tote on his back, you know, and then as soon as they're old enough to walk on their own, they carried a stick and they triumphed through the hills with Dad.
Tim and I and Elise went up to Comanche Lake in the Sangre de Cristo once.
We didn't climb the big mountains together, but we climbed places like Beulah, Mountain Park, and things like that.
I remember one trip we went with Steve and Linda, and Ben and Tim were with us, and we went to South Colony and we did some fishing there.
Steve took Robert on at least 5 of the 14ers.
We did a hut trip with Linda a couple winters ago. Had a really good time. No, it was with Elise.
My son, I think that Steve's leadership and mentorship with my kids has made a difference.
Still, I think they are inspired by a lot of what he taught them and what he did for them while he was here. So I think he was a very good father.
He was a very compassionate father and nurturing father. I believe that Steve loved his girls with all of his heart and soul, and he loved Nona too.
He loved his girls so much. His screensaver at work would go back and forth between pictures of some mountains and pictures of his kids. He adored both of them.
Another thing that stands out to me about Steve is friendship. Through climbing and teaching and kids playing together, we still were friends and stayed friends. And even if we didn't climb, we still were in touch with each other, in contact with each other.
Well, I could tell you the story of when he acted like a brother. We were climbing Wham Ridge, and unknown to me, he had put a big rock in my pack. It was Marlon and Steve and I. And anyway, I was like, boy, it's a little harder this time. I'm not too sure why I'm breathing a little heavier going up. Well, we get to the summit, and I opened up my pack, and darn if there's this big rock in there. Well, that would be a trick that a brother would pull on a sister.
I started running because of Steve, because if I was going to climb 14ers and be with Steve to do this, then I needed to get in shape. And I ran by myself for a couple years, and then I invited Steve to go one afternoon. Hey, Steve, you want to meet me out at the reservoir and we'll go run some trails? But he wasn't a regular exerciser by any means. He went with me just because he wanted to be with somebody. Yeah. Also, he wanted to see me fulfill my goal of running that marathon. And I'm gonna tear up now. That's one of the things I really, really miss is running with Steve. Just that time with him and going through stuff. And now I run by myself. I'm looking for somebody else to go with me. And
I would come in earlier, he would come in early, and we just sought each other out because we would just fall into each other's arms and cry. First of all, my daughter has been extremely stable for a long time now. And Linda, of course, has reached a point of stability that she didn't already always have. But there were times when it got really rough. But one of the last times he ever physically touched me, my younger daughter had lost a job again. And I went into his room and I just put my head down like this on the desk near him, and he just reached over with his hand and stroked my head because he knew that I was heartbroken. And when the times came that things went well, I mean, it could be some little thing that the parent of a child who didn't have issues would just say, oh, how very nice. There would be such rejoicing, and we would seek each other out to rejoice because we knew that that other person gets it. He definitely blessed my life. I'm an English teacher, so after Steve passed, I thought, is there one word I could use to describe him as I best knew him? And the word that stuck was nurturer. There are people who can walk into a garden and see the plants that are healthy and rejoice and maybe tweak a little here or a little there to make them their best. And then there are the plants that are struggling. And you can see that something is amiss, and so you work really hard with those things. Steve did that with humans. We had a lot of students who were grown and out and starting families of their own, and they would bring their babies back. He was just a nurturing person. It was so funny, we would make fun of him like crazy because our kids, who are now in their 20s and some of them almost 30s because we taught high school, would come back with their babies. And you know how women are with babies. But Steve was worse. I'd say, hey, take that baby and put it in Mr. Gladbach's arms and watch him. He sniffed the baby's head and caressed its cheeks. And they'd come back and they'd go, oh my God, Mrs. Marino, he's worse than a woman. I said, I know. I said, he loves babies. He was with humans the way a master gardener was with plants. I retired this year, and as I left him, he gave me a big old hug and a very sweet card. And he said, I'm gonna miss you. And I said, I'm gonna miss you too, but neither one of us are gone. So when I got the word that he truly was gone, it was really hard because I knew that that was one less phone number I could use.
I just miss not being able to pick up the phone and just say, hey, what's up? How's things going?
When he died, Bill McCullough and I made the decision, because I had a Facebook page that was mostly dedicated to my kids, my former kids, they're everywhere. And he knew I would reach most of the kids. And I just wrote in there, I have some bad news to share. This weekend, Mr. Gladbach went up the mountain, and this time God decided to keep him. And the outpouring was incredible. And one young woman said she saw somewhere that he was from Kansas, and she called me and said, Mrs. Marino, where in Kansas? I'm gonna drive. And I said, oh honey, there will be a memorial service for him here. And she said, okay. But I was gonna drive because I had to have a chance to say goodbye, because he's the only one who made me understand, and if I hadn't understood, I would have never made it this far. But I kind of feel like he's there.
And just knowing that, you know, he's right around the corner.
And I hope that the girls and his family understand that I really believe he is.
He will be watching over everyone a lot, and watching over the girls especially.
The Colorado Trail, which is close to 500 miles, 89,000 feet of elevation gain, and it was done in the 80s, and Steve and our friend Mark Smaltz, that's how they met, was working on the Colorado Trail. So he was a very integral part of getting the Colorado Trail finished, but while I was out on the trail this summer, boy, Steve was with me the whole time. He was always on my mind. This was when I was backpacking by myself, but it was very healing being above timberline, because that's where Steve loved best.
Our friend Shirley, she was our community outreach person. She was a person who was very physically demonstrative and affectionate, and Steve figured that out. And every single morning, he would come in and he would say, Shirley, how was your night? And he would just wrap his arms around her, give her a big bear hug and say, it's gonna be a good day. And she and I have had lunch a couple of times after he passed, and she looked at me and she said, it's not so much that I miss that hug every day, it's just that I can't imagine this world without him in it. It's less. It's just less because he's gone.